The Mystery of the Missing Necklace, Chapter 17. Mr. Goon Gets a Few Shocks. Larry rushed over to the cupboard. The key was still in the lock. He turned it and the door opened. And there was poor Fatty, still wrapped up in the curtain. "Fatty, what's happened?" cried Larry. "Are you hurt?" "Not a bit, except that my wrists and ankles are aching with the rope round them," said Fatty. "Got a knife, Larry? Cut the rope." Larry cut the ropes, and soon Fatty was unwrapping himself from the curtain. He tossed it into a corner with the cut ropes. He took off Napoleon's uniform and put on his own clothes. Then he shut and locked the cupboard door. "Oh, Larry," he said, "wasn't I glad to hear your voice? But don't let's talk in here. Let's get back home quick." "My parents think I'm in bed," said Larry. "I'll come to your house if you like." "Your parents won't be there, will they?" "Come on." "Right. We'll tell about everything when we get back," said Fatty. They made their way back over the fields as fast as they could. They soon got to Fatty's house and let themselves in cautiously. They went up to his room and Fatty flung himself on the bed, rubbing his ankles ruefully. "Larry, how did you manage to come back and rescue me?" he asked. "I would have been there for hours if you hadn't. That beast, Mr. Goon, wouldn't let me out. Now you tell me your story first." "There isn't really anything to tell," said Larry. "I went back home and told Daisy all we had done. And then about 9:30, when I was in bed, Pip turned up and threw stones at my window." "Whatever for?" said Fatty. "Well, Bets sent him," said Larry. "Pip said she was awfully upset and wouldn't go to sleep, and kept crying and saying she knew you had got into danger. You know the silly feelings Bets gets sometimes. So Pip, thinking it would be fun to hear how you had got on dressing me up as Napoleon, told Bets he would go round and see you," said Fatty. "It would make Bets feel better and be a bit of excitement for old Pip." "I see that. But what made you come along down to the waxwork hall?" "I don't exactly know," said Larry. "You know, once before Bets got the idea that you were in danger, and it turned out she was right. And I just thought, well, I thought it might be a good idea if I slipped down to the waxwork hall and just had a snoop round to see what was happening." "Golly, I'm glad Bets had one of her feelings," said Fatty thankfully. "And I'm glad you came down, Larry, old boy." "So am I," said Larry. "When I got there, the hall was in darkness, and there was nobody about at all. So I opened that window, got in, and called your name. That's all." There was a silence. Fatty suddenly looked extremely gloomy. "What's up?" said Larry. "You haven't told me what happened yet, or why you got locked up. Were you discovered after all?" Fatty began his tale. Larry listened in astonishment. So Mr. Goon had been there too. When Fatty came to Mr. Goon's knees and related how he, Fatty, had been caught because of it, and not Mr. Goon, Larry was most sympathetic. "Poor old Fatty. So Mr. Goon got all the information, left you there, the beast, and has gone to do the arresting and reporting. Quite a busy evening for him." "He said he would come back and let me out of that cupboard when the fun was over," said Fatty, beginning to grin. "He'll be surprised to find I'm gone, won't he?" "He will," said Larry. "He won't know what's happened. Let's pretend to him that we don't know where you are, shall we? We'll go and ask him about you tomorrow. He'll have 20 fits if he thinks you have vanished. He won't know what to think. And he'll feel most uncomfortable because he'll know he jolly well ought to have let me out," said Fatty. "Well, I'm going to bed, Larry. You'd better go and get some sleep too." "Oh, I do feel so disappointed. After all our work and disguises and plans for Mr. Goon to solve the mystery and get all the credit." The boys parted and Larry ran swiftly home. He wondered what Mr. Goon was doing. He thought about the Castleton mansion and wondered if the thieves were at work, if the house was being quietly surrounded, if Mr. Goon was doing some arresting. Well, maybe it would all be in the papers tomorrow. Mr. Goon had certainly done some good work that night. He had surrounded the mansion with men whilst the thieves were actually inside. He had arrested all four of them, although one, alas, had got away in the struggle, and Mr. Goon was feeling very pleased with himself indeed. The escaped thief would soon be caught, not a doubt of that. It wasn't until past midnight that Mr. Goon suddenly remembered that he had left Fatty locked up in the cupboard in the waxworks hall. Drat that boy, he thought. I could go to bed now and sleep easy if it wasn't for getting him out of that cupboard. He has had a nice long time there to think about all his misdeeds. He has. Well, I'd better get along and let him out and give him a few good words of advice too. He's missed all the fun this time, and I have solved the mystery. Not him. Ha! Mr. Goon cycled down to the waxworks hall and, leaving his bicycle outside, went into the hall. He switched on his torch and walked to the cupboard. He rapped smartly on it. Hey, you, he said, ready to be let out yet? We have done everything, and now that the fun is over, you can come along out. There was no answer. Mr. Goon rapped loudly again, thinking that Fatty had gone to sleep, but still there was no answer. A little cold feeling crept round Mr. Goon's heart. Surely that boy was all right. Hurriedly Mr. Goon turned the key in the lock and opened the door. He shone his light into the cupboard. Napoleon looked back at him, standing there in his undergarment, but no Fatty. Mr. Goon's hands began to tremble. Where was that boy? He couldn't get out of a locked cupboard, or could he? Mr. Goon remembered how Fatty had apparently passed mysteriously through a locked door in the last mystery. Mr. Goon poked Napoleon in the ribs to make sure he was Wax and not Fatty. Napoleon did not flinch. He looked straight at Mr. Goon. Yes, he was Wax, all right. Mr. Goon shut the door, puzzled and upset. Now, where was that boy? Had somebody carried him off? He had seen him bound and gagged, so he couldn't have escaped by himself. Well, then, what had happened? Mr. Goon went home slowly, pedaling with heavy feet. He ought to have let that boy free before he had gone after the gang. Suppose he didn't turn up in the morning? What explanation could he give to the inspector? He was seeing him at 10 o'clock. Mr. Goon gave a heavy sigh. He had been looking forward to that interview. Now he wasn't so sure. That boy was very friendly with the inspector. If it came out that anything had happened to him, Inspector Jenks might ask some very awkward questions. Drat that boy. Fatty slept soundly that night, tired out with his adventures. Mr. Goon slept too, but not so soundly. He dreamt about his great success in arresting the gang, but every time he was about to receive words of praise from the inspector, Fatty came into the dream, tied up, begging for help. It was most disturbing because he woke Mr. Goon up each time, and then he found it hard to go to sleep again. At 9 o'clock, the five find-outers were all together in Pip's garden, going over and over the happenings of the night before. All of them were most indignant with Mr. Goon for leaving Fatty in the cupboard. We are going to make him think Fatty has been spirited away, said Larry with a grin. We'll wait about the village for him, and each time he passes any of us, we'll ask him if he has heard anything of Fatty. So, at 9:30, the children, with the exception of Fatty, of course, hung about near Mr. Goon's house, waiting for him to come out. Larry was at the corner, Pip was near the house, and Daisy and Bets were not far off. Larry gave a whistle when he saw Mr. Goon coming out, wheeling his bicycle, ready to ride over to see the inspector. He looked very smart indeed, for he had brushed his uniform, cleaned his belt and helmet and shoes, and polished his buttons till they shone. He was the very picture, he hoped, of a smart policeman awaiting promotion. I say, Mr. Goon, called Pip, as the policeman prepared to mount his bicycle. Do you know where our friend Frederick is? Why should I? Scowled Mr. Goon, but his hat sank, so that boy had vanished. Well, we just wondered, said Pip. I suppose you haven't seen him at all. Mr. Goon couldn't say that. He mounted his bicycle and rode off, his face red. He hoped that boy Fatty wasn't going to cause a lot of trouble, just as he, Mr. Goon, had got things going so very nicely. He passed Daisy and Bets. Daisy called out, Oh, Mr. Goon, have you seen Fatty? Do tell us if you have. I don't know where he is, said Mr. Goon desperately, and cycled on. But at the corner there was Larry. Mr. Goon! Mr. Goon! Have you seen Fatty? Do you know where he is? Do you think he has disappeared? Mr. Goon, do tell us where he is. Have you locked him up? Course not, spluttered Mr. Goon. He'll turn up. He'll turn up like a bad penny, you may be sure. He rode on, feeling most uncomfortable. Where could the boy be? Had that thief who escaped gone back to the hall and taken Fatty? No, that couldn't be, surely. But where was that boy? The inspector was waiting for Mr. Goon in his office. On his desk were various reports of the happenings of the night before, sent in not only by Mr. Goon but by two other policemen who had helped in the arrests, and by plainclothes detectives who had also been on the case. He also had reports on what the three prisoners had said when questioned. Some smart work had been done, there was no doubt about that, but something was worrying the inspector. Mr. Goon saw it as soon as he got into the office. He had hoped and expected to find his superior officer full of smiles and praise. But no, the inspector looked rather solemn and a bit worried. Why? Well, Goon, said the inspector, some good work appears to have been done on this case, but it's a pity about the pearls, isn't it? Mr. Goon gaped. The pearls, sir? What about them? We have got them, sir. Took them off one of the gang. Huh, but you see, they are not the stolen pearls, said the inspector gently. No, Goon, they are just a cheap necklace the man was going to give his girl. The real pearls have vanished.